The set was built for comfort, strategically lit, minimalist in design, with soft gray tones and polished glass furniture intended to create an atmosphere of transparency. Every camera angle had been rehearsed, every lighting cue was marked. A gentle spotlight hovered over the pair of chairs at center stage, waiting for its subjects. Tonight's segment was branded as The Questions That Matter, a highly publicized primetime interview meant to probe the minds of global influencers. The network had teased it for weeks, an unfiltered conversation with Elon Musk. The promotion had promised bold questions, real answers, no safe zones. The host was Nadine Weller, a veteran journalist celebrated for her piercing intellect and refusal to be intimidated. She'd once walked a sitting senator off the stage with nothing more than a 3-minute line of questioning. She didn't interrupt with noise. She interrupted with facts. She came prepared, and she came sharp. Elon Musk arrived just before airtime, flanked by no PR handlers, no entourage. Just him, hair slightly tousled, shirt wrinkled in a way that looked accidental but wasn't. He greeted the stage crew with a brief nod, then took his seat opposite Nadine as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. The theme music faded. The camera pushed in, and they were live. Nadine began with courtesy, laying the foundation of civility. "Mr. Musk, thank you for joining us." Elon offered a small smile, that half-detached look he wore so often, like he was simultaneously listening and already running advanced calculations in the back of his mind. "Glad to be here," she leaned in. "Let's talk legacy. You're one of the wealthiest people in history, responsible for companies that have changed how we think about cars, space, communication, even artificial intelligence. And yet, you're one of the most polarizing figures of the modern age. Why do you think that is?" Elon's answer was immediate, unfiltered. "Because I refuse to behave in ways that make people comfortable at the cost of progress." Nadine didn't blink. "So you see your critics as a sign of progress?" "I see them as a sign I'm hitting the right nerve," he said. "Comfort never changed the world. Disruption did." She shifted forward, her tone still calm but deliberate. "Let's test that idea. SpaceX. Your goal isn't just to launch satellites or supply the ISS. You've said repeatedly you want to die on Mars, just not on impact." A few light chuckles rippled through the studio, but Elon didn't laugh. "You want to move the human species to another planet, what many would consider science fiction. Isn't that at best unrealistic and at worst escapist?" Elon's gaze sharpened. "Do you think it was realistic when the Wright brothers said humans could fly? Or when we first went to the moon with less computing power than the phone in your pocket?" He leaned in slightly. "Was it escapist when we built the internet or just expansion?" Nadine raised a hand. "Expansion is one thing, but aren't we abandoning Earth in the process? Shouldn't we be fixing this planet first?" He responded without hesitation. "That's a false binary. You don't abandon your home because you build a second one. You don't stop planting trees because you bought insurance. The question isn't either or, it's why not both?" She hesitated. Just slightly. Enough to feel the shift. He saw it and pressed in. "Let me ask you something," Elon said, flipping the dynamic midstream. "How much funding do we put into the Department of Defense each year?" Nadine straightened. "Roughly $800 billion. "Right," Elon nodded. "And how much into the space program?" She paused. "Far less." "Exactly," he said. "So, if we're serious about protecting the species, why does the budget say we're more interested in killing each other than surviving as a whole?" That landed. Not with a bang, but a slow, widening silence. She tried to recover. "But your critics would argue that's precisely the issue, that you have too much power. You control not just rockets and cars, but information, through Starlink, through Twitter. That's unprecedented. Are you comfortable being that central to so many global systems?" He tilted his head. "No, but I'm more comfortable doing something than waiting for someone else to. History doesn't reward the hesitant." The air in the studio changed. No one had moved, but something was different. He wasn't charming. He wasn't careful. But he was irrefutable. And Nadine, master of redirection, felt the weight of that. She flipped the card in front of her, quickly, more urgently now. Let's talk labor practices at Tesla. But Elon leaned forward, calmly, casually, and said, let's. He was ready, and for the first time in her career, Nadine Weller blinked, because she could feel it. He wasn't there to be interviewed. He was there to take control, and before the hour was done, he would. Nadine Weller adjusted her seat, visibly, not with nervousness, but with the kind of micro-shift that veteran interviewers made when they realized the temperature of a conversation was changing. The cards in her hand no longer felt like cues. They felt like shields. And Elon Musk? He sat with the unnerving ease of someone who'd already walked through fire and memorized the way it burned. She cleared her throat softly, shifting to a new angle. Tesla's success is undeniable. Record sales, global demand, an electric revolution. But behind the curtain, there have been repeated concerns: worker fatigue, anti-union sentiment, pressure on assembly lines. You've called your factories modern temples of production. Others have called them exploitative. Which is it? Elon didn't miss a beat. It's hard. That's the truth. Building anything worthwhile is hard. These are not startups in a garage anymore. They're industrial ecosystems. We're not making apps. We're making machines that move people and eventually humanity itself. He turned to face her more directly. You think people can create innovation without sweat? Without discipline? Ask the people who stayed late to make sure ventilators shipped during COVID. Ask the engineers who worked double shifts to solve battery degradation. You'll find tired people, but also proud people. We push because the world needs pushing. Nadine tried to interject, but Elon pressed on, not with hostility, but with momentum. And when it comes to unions, I'm not anti-union. I'm anti-complacency. If we treated people like disposable parts, our company wouldn't have lasted 6 months. Do you think SpaceX survives if people don't believe in the mission? She countered. Belief doesn't pay bills. What about the reports of underpaid contract workers, safety complaints? Elon interrupted, but not to dodge. To clarify, you're referring to 2 third-party audits, both flagged issues and both led to immediate policy changes. We don't hide that. We fix it. In fact, we publish safety reports quarterly. Name one other automaker who does that with the same transparency. She paused, searched, came up empty. He smiled, but it wasn't smug. It was pointed. Exactly. The tension shifted again. He wasn't stonewalling. He wasn't deflecting. He was disarming her with data, and behind the data, something more dangerous: conviction. Nadine exhaled through her nose and moved to the next question, hoping to reclaim ground. You've been criticized for your behavior online, especially since acquiring Twitter. Erratic tweets, attacks on journalists, spreading memes that some consider offensive or conspiratorial. Do you not see the responsibility that comes with that level of influence? Elon's expression didn't shift. Oh, I see it, he said, and I reject the idea that responsibility means silence. He leaned forward slightly, and the lights caught a flicker in his eyes. Social media was supposed to be the town square, not the cathedral. You don't go there to worship consensus, you go to challenge it. And yes, I post memes. I post thoughts at 3 a.m. I speak like a human, not a PR department. If that makes people uncomfortable, good. They should be. Comfort breeds blindness, Nadine fired back. But what about disinformation? You've said free speech matters more than feelings, but there are real consequences when false narratives spread unchecked. I agree, Elon said simply. But the cure for false speech is more speech, not censorship. Let bad ideas compete in the open and die from exposure, not suppression. You don't defeat a lie by hiding it. You kill it with sunlight. It was a philosophy, and it was terrifying to anyone whose job depended on controlling the flow of ideas. The studio dimmed, slightly as the camera panned for commercial break. The producer's voice rang in Nadine's ear. 2 minutes to reset. She nodded. Elon remained perfectly still, eyes scanning nothing in particular, as if calculating starship thrust vectors while waiting to resume a debate. When the cameras rolled again, Nadine didn't bother easing back in. She came hard. "Final segment," she said. "AI. You've warned about it, you've invested in it, and now you're developing it. So which is it? Are you building the thing you once said could destroy us?" Elon's reply came like a scalpel through fog. "Yes." She stared. "You're admitting to developing something that could wipe us out?" He nodded. "Because if we don't build it safely, someone else will build it recklessly." He shifted in his chair for the first time. His voice dropped, not in volume, but in tone, becoming something closer to a confession. "I've been warning about AI for a decade, and during that time, every major tech company has been doing exactly what I feared, speeding toward intelligence with no oversight. So now I'm trying to build something better, transparent, aligned with humanity, competitive enough to be relevant, ethical enough to matter." He paused, then looked directly into the lens. "I'd rather be at the table building fire breaks than watching from a distance as the house burns." The silence that followed wasn't staged. It wasn't timed for effect. It simply was. The kind of silence that happens when no one, not even the interviewer, knows what to say. Nadine Weller opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time in her career, there were no cards to reach for, no retort to load. She stared at Elon Musk across a table that no longer felt like hers, and the audience, watching from millions of living rooms, saw it. Elon Musk had just said what no one else dared, and Nadine Weller was speechless. The silence lingered for a moment longer, thick and undisturbed, a silence so loud it felt like the air had stopped moving in the studio. Nadine Weller, known across the country for her relentless surgical interviews, sat still, her hands hovering over her stack of cue cards as if they could shield her from what had just unfolded. But they couldn't. Elon Musk hadn't stonewalled her. He hadn't deflected or evaded or buried her questions in corporate vagueness. He had done something much more devastating. He had answered them, honestly, uncomfortably, unapologetically. When the commercial break finally rolled in, it felt like an exhale the entire room had been holding. The stage manager called time, the lights shifted ever so slightly, and crew members moved with hushed urgency to prepare for the final segment. Nadine leaned back, blinking for the first time in a while. Elon remained seated exactly as he was, calm, composed, as if the entire first half of the interview had been a warm-up lap. Off camera, the producers scrambled. In the control booth, the executive producer ran a hand through his hair and leaned into the mic. "Keep the next block rolling. No cuts, no graphics, don't interrupt this." The cameras came back live before Nadine was ready, her face still locked in a thoughtful expression. But she was a professional. She recovered in seconds, sat up straight, and clasped her hands together on the table in front of her. "We're back," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual edge. "Mr. Musk, before the break, you made what I think many would consider a staggering admission, that you are willingly building artificial intelligence systems despite believing they may become dangerous." Elon gave the faintest nod. "Because pretending it won't happen doesn't stop it. Someone has to steer the future, not just spectate." "Do you really believe," she pressed, "that you're the one best equipped to steer it?" Elon looked directly at her. "No, but I am one of the few willing to be held publicly accountable for doing it." That landed, not just with her, but with the viewers watching across the globe. Because whether people loved him or hated him, no one could deny that Elon Musk didn't hide. He didn't disappear into layers of bureaucracy or speak only through filtered press releases. He showed up. He spoke. Even when it was reckless. Even when it was raw. And somehow that made him more real than the system he so often challenged. Nadine regrouped. She flipped to a new card. Her voice returned with a steadier tone. "Let's talk power. You own or lead companies that influence transportation, energy, telecommunications, space travel, artificial intelligence. You control satellites in orbit, and you quite literally shape the internet in parts of the world. Doesn't that scare you?" "It should scare everyone," Elon replied, "which is why I keep inviting more people to the table, more voices, more oversight. The real danger is when one person has power and no scrutiny. I get more scrutiny than anyone alive. Maybe in history. She tilted her head. Are you saying your critics are helping you? Elon nodded. Absolutely. They're part of the immune system. I listen to them, even when they hate me, especially when they hate me. But the ones who matter are the ones who criticize with facts, not just feelings. Nadine flipped again, this time pulling a question she'd saved for later. A sharper. 1. You've been accused of playing fast and loose with regulations. Tesla has clashed with the SEC. SpaceX has sparred with FAA flight protocols. Twitter moderation under your leadership has sparked political outrage. Are you above the rules? Elon's face didn't twitch, but his voice came colder. I'm not above the rules, I'm ahead of them. She blinked. That sounds... He interrupted, not rudely, but definitively. Rules exist to protect people. Good rules evolve, bad ones stagnate. Most institutions build rules for the world that was, not the world that's coming. So yes, I move fast, sometimes too fast, but you don't build the future at the speed of paperwork. He tapped the table gently, a soft staccato under his next words. You build it at the speed of urgency. The sound crew glanced at each other. Even the camera operator was leaning in now. Nadine tried to refocus. So, what's the end game? What's the legacy? How do you want to be remembered? Elon didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the table for a moment, as though digging through layers of noise to reach something that mattered. Then, quietly, I don't care if I'm remembered. I care if we make it. Nadine looked at him. Something in her face softened. She wasn't interviewing a mogul anymore. She was sitting across from a man who, despite every eccentricity, every flaw, every controversy, believed in something bigger than himself. And in that moment, she had no words. Not because she was defeated, but because for the first time in a long time, she was listening. Elon Musk had left her speechless, not with arrogance, not with outrage, but with something far more difficult to disarm, a vision that refused to wait for permission. The studio was quieter now, not in sound, but in sensation. Something about the interview had moved into a different dimension, where confrontation had given way to contemplation. The audience, both in studio and scattered across millions of homes, no longer watched out of curiosity. They were witnessing something unfolding that wasn't performance. It was revelation. Elon Musk didn't dominate with volume. He didn't need to. He spoke in a rhythm that bent space around it, drawing every thought inward like gravity around a collapsing star. Even Nadine Weller, hardened by decades of high-stakes interviews, felt herself caught in the orbit. She adjusted, the final set of cue cards before her, but didn't reach for them. Her fingers hovered, uncertain, then settled. You said you don't care if you're remembered, she began, voice softer now, but that you care whether we make it. What does that mean to you? Elon didn't look at her. He looked through her, or maybe past her, into something else entirely. It means we don't end up as a blip, he said quietly. A clever species that invented Wi-Fi and rockets and then choked on its own apathy. We're the only known life that can ask why we're here. That means something. It's not just about building. It's about surviving with meaning. Nadine stayed silent. For once, she didn't press. He continued. If we don't become multiplanetary, all of this, art, music, mathematics, stories, pain, love, it dies with us. One asteroid, one engineered virus, one failure in climate reversal. That's all it takes. I don't think people understand how fragile we are on a cosmic scale. He looked back at her. I'm not afraid of failure. I'm afraid of extinction. A pause. Then quietly. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. The studio didn't breathe. Not really. Nadine opened her mouth, but no words came. The cards in her hand were useless now. The script had unraveled completely. And what replaced it was far more powerful. But Elon, she said finally, not everyone sees the world like you do. Not everyone wants Mars. Some people want healthcare, peace, stability, safety. What do you say to people who believe you're chasing stars while ignoring the problems on the ground? He nodded slowly, respectfully. That's fair, but it's not either or. Mars is not an escape plan. It's a forcing function, a challenge so big that it pushes us to become better right here. You can't build a society on another planet unless you figure out how to grow food in closed systems, power cities sustainably, cure disease in isolation, manage conflict without war. He paused again. Mars forces us to evolve, socially, technologically, spiritually, and we'll bring that evolution back with us. Then his voice grew lower, more personal. I grew up feeling like the world didn't make sense, that people didn't ask the right questions, that we were solving the wrong problems. I got bullied, beaten. I didn't talk much, but I read everything. Science fiction, philosophy, engineering books, AI theory, quantum mechanics. I didn't want to be rich. I wanted to fix things. He looked at her again. People think I'm a businessman. I'm not. I'm an engineer with deadlines. And there it was. No embellishment, no arrogance. Just a glimpse into the engine room of the man they had come to judge, interrogate, admire, or despise. And for the first time, even Nadine Weller, the relentless interviewer with a wall of Emmys, didn't have a question ready. Because some answers fill the room so completely, there's no space left for rebuttal. The control room, watching from behind, soundproof glass stayed frozen. They'd received dozens of real-time analytics since the interview began, record viewership numbers, surging engagement, trending hashtags. But none of that mattered now. The story had shifted. This was no longer about headlines or ratings. This was something rarer. A moment, unstaged, unsanitized, undeniable, and Elon Musk, without raising his voice, had taken command of it. Nadine leaned forward slightly. Do you ever rest? Elon smiled, tired but honest. When I can, but the clock's ticking. Every second we waste is a second the wrong people build the wrong future. She held his gaze. And you still think you're the right person to lead it? His response came without hesitation. No, but I'm the one who refused to wait for permission. And that answer, simple, unshakable, landed like a thunderclap under velvet. Nadine sat back in her chair. Her final card slipped from her hand and landed on the floor with a sound only the microphones could catch. She didn't reach for it. There was nothing left to ask, because Elon Musk hadn't come for a conversation. He had come to change the direction of it, and somehow he already had. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was earned. A rare, reverent stillness that can only come when something undeniable has been said and no one dares to follow it with noise. The air in the studio was heavier now, not from tension, but from realization. Elon Musk had peeled back the layers, not just of his mind, but of the times they were living in, of the fragility they ignored, of the stakes they had forgotten. Nadine Weller sat back, her fingers laced together on the table, not in preparation to strike but to steady herself. For the first time in her broadcast career, she was no longer navigating an interview. She was witnessing a reckoning. Across the country and around the world, millions of viewers leaned toward their screens. Social media threads had long since stopped mocking the eccentric billionaire. The tone had shifted. People weren't arguing anymore. They were absorbing. In control rooms from rival networks, competitors watched the feed and understood something quietly devastating. They'd underestimated him. They'd all tried to frame him, define him, contain him inside narratives that made him safer, more predictable, more digestible. But Elon Musk didn't fit inside frames. He bent them, and in this room, in this hour, he had made that clear. Nadine finally spoke again. Slowly, measured, as if treading carefully on the edge of something sacred. You've said a lot tonight that's going to provoke people. Some will say you're arrogant. Some will say you're unhinged. Some will say you're dangerous. What do you say to them? Elon's eyes didn't narrow. He didn't take offense. If anything, he looked tired. Not physically, but spiritually, like someone carrying a burden that had outgrown his own shoulders. I I agree, he said. Nadine blinked. I am arrogant sometimes, he continued, because humility doesn't build rockets. And yeah, I can be unhinged. Show me one person who tried to change the world without being called insane. And as for dangerous? He paused. That's the word people use when you refuse to obey the limits they put on you. The audience fell into breathless silence. Again. Elon leaned forward now, elbows on the table, hands clasped. I'm not trying to be a saint. I'm trying to be useful. He sat back again, eyes distant now. We don't have time to wait for perfect people to lead us. We don't have time to argue about tone while the planet warms and the AIs wake up and the next pandemic gets ready to crawl out of the jungle. He gestured vaguely, like painting an invisible constellation in the air. All of this, is temporary. Every empire, every technology, every species, unless we decide not to be, unless we build in ways that last longer than us. That's what I care about. Nadine looked at him, something unfamiliar flickering behind her eyes. Respect, yes, but also something deeper, a kind of awe, maybe, or humility. I don't think I've ever had an interview like this, she admitted softly. Elon's reply came quick. Neither have I. They both laughed quietly, not out of amusement, but relief. The tension broke, just slightly, like thunderclouds giving way to a single shaft of light. Then she asked something she hadn't planned, something not written on a card. What scares you? For the first time, Elon hesitated. Then, with more weight than anything he'd said yet. Apathy. He let the word hang there. Alone. Undecorated. True. I'm not afraid of robots or Mars missions failing or being canceled online, he continued. But if people stop caring, if they stop asking what else, stop building, stop dreaming, that's the real extinction. Nadine nodded slowly. There was nothing more to say to that. They sat in silence for a moment, the clock ticking toward the end of the segment. The producers whispered through headsets, trying to calculate how to close out something that no longer fit within the confines of a show. Finally, the stage manager held up the signal. 1 minute remaining. Nadine turned to the camera for the closing. We promised you an unfiltered conversation tonight, she said. We didn't know we'd get something more. She looked at Elon one last time. Mr. Musk, thank you for joining us. Elon offered a nod. Thanks for listening. And that was it. No grand finale, no polished closing statement. No soaring music, just two people, one question, and a world now watching differently. Because in the course of one interview, Elon Musk had done what algorithms, headlines, and opinion pieces had failed to do for years. He had made people feel the future again. And in doing so, he didn't just leave a reporter speechless. He left a planet thinking. The screen faded to black. No theme music, no recap, no highlight reel. Just the slow, deliberate fade that marked the end of something. More than a broadcast, the end of an encounter. In the control room, no one spoke at first. The producer sat back, hands limp at his sides, headset forgotten on his shoulders. Around him, crew members exchanged glances that said everything. Did that just happen? Back in the studio, Nadine Weller removed her mic slowly. Her hands weren't shaking, but they had the kind of stillness that only came after adrenaline had drained from the body. She looked across the now empty stage where Elon had just sat, the imprint of his presence still lingering like static in the air. For the first time in a decade, she didn't know what the headline would be. She didn't want to control the narrative. She just wanted to let it breathe. Elon had already left. No handlers, no press huddle, no Instagram post in the green room. He'd walked out through the service hallway, unnoticed by the crowd forming outside the main entrance. It wasn't escape. It was efficiency. He'd done what he came to do, and now he had other futures to build. On the internet, the effect was immediate and seismic. Within 10 minutes, the interview had been clipped, subtitled, and uploaded in 6 languages. Hashtags lit up. Musk interview and speechless, the future doesn't wait. Comments poured in faster than moderators could read them, but they weren't arguments. Not yet. Not this time. They were quiet, reflective. A wave of people saying things like, "I've never seen him like that." That wasn't arrogance, that was urgency. "I don't know if I agree with him, but I believe he means it. What if he's right?" Inside university classrooms, professors were already revising their Monday lesson plans. Philosophy instructors clipped the AI segment. Ethics panels prepared for impromptu discussion groups. High school teachers shared links with the subject. Line. "Watch this, then write what you think." World leaders had seen it too. Even those who mocked him in private watched the full hour in silence, arms folded, wondering if they'd just witnessed a crack in the narrative they had been controlling for years. CEOs, scientists, engineers, writers, everyone felt it. Not because he'd said anything brand new, but because he had said it without blinking, without softening the truth, without shaping his words for applause, without apology. And that left an impact no algorithm could predict. Somewhere, in a small apartment with a half-dead plant on the windowsill and bills stacked beneath a coffee-stained mug, a young girl who'd once stopped dreaming was sketching again. Rockets. Cities under domes. A world reborn in another sky. Because someone had reminded her it was possible. Elsewhere, an exhausted father on a third shift, surrounded by fluorescent lights and exhaustion, pulled out his phone and rewatched the clip, where Elon said, "We don't have time to wait for perfect people to lead us." And for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. And far away, in a control room at SpaceX, a team of engineers, some who'd missed the interview entirely, were still working. Testing thrusters, calibrating data from the latest Starlink deployment. Because the work never stops, not when the mission is survival. Back in her dressing room, Nadine Weller sat in front of the mirror, staring not at her reflection, but at the notepad in her lap. Page after page of questions, most of them now crossed out. She picked up a pen and scribbled 5 words on the last blank line. Words she never expected to write. He wasn't the story. We are. Because the truth wasn't that Elon Musk had dismantled her questions or hijacked her platform. The truth was that he had held up a mirror. Not to her, but to us. To everyone who watched, wondering what came next, hoping someone else would figure it out. And in doing so, he reminded us of the most dangerous, beautiful truth of all. The future isn't waiting, and neither was he.